Hi, it's Mr. Surface. Welcome to another edition of the 221 Book Club. I'd say the general theme is of these round of books for the book club would be encountering new places, encountering America, encountering identity. And I have like a little fun collage up here of the books and a little picture in the center to kind of organize it of an American flag that's made up of so many different hues, but it still coalesces into this identity. So we're going to see how characters in some of these books and memoirs and screenplays and fantasy novels encounter their identities. And it's just a wonderful book. I'd love to talk about any of these titles with you. Let's get started. Abraham Verghese' Cutting for Stone involves two brothers, one of which at one point leaves Ethiopia and comes to New York. And he describes America this way and New York in this way, and I thought it'd be a good way to start it off because it's such a different frame than anyone who's used to American cities would have. So let's take a listen, let's take a look. Superorganism. The biologists coined that word for our giant African ant colonies, claiming that consciousness and intelligence resided not in the individual ant but in the collective ant mind. The trail of red taillights stretching to the horizon as day broke around us made me think of that term. Order and purpose must reside somewhere other than within each vehicle, and that morning I heard the hum, the respiration of the superorganism. It's a sound I believe that only the new immigrant hears, but not for long. By the time I learned to say 6-inch number 7 on rye with Swiss hold the lettuce, the sound too was gone, became part of what the mind would label silence. You were now subsumed into the superorganism. The silhouette of this most famous city, the twin exclamation marks at one end, King Kong's climbing toy in the middle, was familiar. Charles Bronson, Gene Hackman, Clint Eastwood, the Empire Theater, and Cinema Dawa had seen to that. My hubris was to think I understood America from such movies, but the real hubris I could see now was America's, and it was a hubris of scale. I saw it in the steel bridges stretching out over water. I saw it in the freeways looping over one another like tangled tapeworms. Hubris was my taxi speedometer, wider than the steering wheel, as if Dolly had grabbed the round gauge and pulled its ears. Hubris was the needle, now showing 70 miles per hour, or well over 110 kilometers per hour, a speed unimaginable in our faithful Volkswagen, even if we'd found a suitable road. What human language captures the dislocation, the acute insufficiency of being in the presence of the superorganism. Right? The awesomeness of humankind and the hubris of our civilizations. And when you encounter a civilization as complex and enormous as America, this young doctor in training describes it so interestingly. I love the tapeworm tangle. Is the book full of descriptions this great? No. There's a lot of drama to enjoy. There's a lot of intrigue. And if you have a young one or you are interested in the medical field, especially liver issues, or someone who wants to be an OBGYN possibly in your connections, or one of your children want to do that, this book is for you. Like you'll love it. All right. Towards that end, Encountering America, this is a piece of historical fiction written as a screenplay by the late Walter Dean Myers, and he even has, in the tradition of historical fiction, has a famous character stop in. In this case, it's Walt Whitman, and it's the riots during the American Civil War in 1863, like July 9th through the 14th, something like that. And it's a race riot, and a lot of the Irish immigrants in New York City were fearful that the newly emancipated slaves from down south would come up north and take their jobs, and so they did awful things, one of which was burning down the colored orphanage. So it's a pretty harrowing book. It's also a YA book. I have about 30 copies here in the classroom, and I'm hoping to read it with students this year. This is a small piece of it, and it gives you kind of another frame for how America grows and understands itself. All right, so we got the immigrants, the Ethiopian immigrants perspective, and now we'll get the perspective out of time in 1863 of a black girl whose parents are mixed, which of course was out of the ordinary then. So that's where identity gets centered on for her, and then she meets Walt Whitman, and we get this scene here. So I want to show it to you real quick. They're rioting the streets, says Claire's mother, the protagonist's mother, and stealing what they can in the bargain. Claire, last night they burned down the colored orphanage. Yes, well, yes, says Walt Whitman, I guess America has finally shaken off the stupor of its promise and its beauty, and is asking itself questions it should have answered 75 years ago. Is it charms you're selling? Bibles? We don't need charms, and we have a Bible. I saw them lying on the battlefields and in the hospitals in Washington. Sometimes I would see them holding up little bits of mirrors and staring at the strangers, looking out at them. In their hearts, they're asking what America means. They're groping their wounds and their trauma and searching for meaning to their lives before those lives drip out onto the rich southern soil or in some obscure cow pasture. Claire, and who do you pretend to be? Right, so they're still kind of teasing Walt Whitman for his verbosity there. I guess you could tease me for using a word like verbosity too. So this is a nice little book, and sort of America's hubris is explored a little more intimately here, and it's kind of a nice book. I would definitely suggest reading it, as a family. Like, it's a good one. All right. This is a collection, and I chose just a small piece of N.K. Jemison's contribution to Gloria Edom's collection, Well-Read Black Girl. And it's an essay called Dreaming Awake. She did the 5th season. There's a few others in her fantasy series. I'm hoping to get to those, but I loved her little essay here, and I wanted to give you a piece of it today. This is from the collection Well-Read Black Girl, Gloria Edom, and it's called Dreaming Awake. Long ago, in the time before now, black people were all kings and queens. This is not true. There is a strange emptiness to a life without myths. I'm an African American, by which I mean a descendant of slaves rather than a descendant of immigrants who came here willingly and with lives more or less intact. My ancestors were the unwilling, unintact ones, children torn from parents, parents torn from elders, and people torn from roots, stories torn from language. Past a certain point, my family's history just stops, as if there was nothing there. I could do what others have done and attempt to reconstruct this lost past, and I could research genealogy and genetics and search for traces for myself in moldering old sale documents and scanned images on microfiche. I could also do what members of other cultures lacking myths have done, steal. A little BS about Atlantis here, some appropriation of other cultures' intellectual property there, and bam! Instant historically justified superiority. Worked great for the Nazis, new and old. Even today, white people in my neck of the woods call themselves Caucasian, most of them little realizing that the term and its history are as constructed as anything sold in the fantasy section of a bookstore. And that's absolutely true. There's an MTV, it's not called Race Matters. Decoded is the show. And on the show Decoded, they talk about the term Caucasian, and it was just kind of made up out of a pseudoscience for white races to feel better about the way they saw the world. And she sort of addresses this further in the essay, but she talks about how there's, in black culture, there hasn't been the opportunity afforded to write the kind of deep fantasy that she wanted when she was growing up. So she took it upon herself to do so, just like Marlon James took it upon himself to write what he called an African Game of Thrones. This book is going to be made into a movie. It is amazing. It's a perfect follow-up to this essay here. I would also say that it's a very rated R. It's extremely violent. There's a lot of sexual content in there. Sort of like any Stephen King book. Like, it's definitely a mixture of genres too. Comic book, horror, action, thriller, adventure, romance. It's kind of all in there. So going from N.K. Jemisin to Marlon James.